Good evening. Thanks for joining us. People in BC woke up to a jump in gas prices thanks to a hike in the carbon tax. As you can see with this protest along Highway 1, political momentum has been building for critics of the carbon tax.
From the rolling fields of Quebec and the bustling streets of Alberta to the hallowed halls of Parliament, Canadians are taking to the streets in a rising tide of protests, with each group vying for attention and recognition. These are farmers, environmentalists, activists, and everyday citizens, all united by a common cause: to fight for a Canada that reflects their values and hopes for the future. With a lot of frustrated, disillusioned, disheartened, and disenfranchised Canadians, the Canadian landscape is slowly morphing into a stage for a myriad of social movements in recent years, each group airing their aggravation for the pesky costs of the country's economic, social, and environmental inclinations. These protests are about more than just numbers. They are about the human stories at the heart of every placard and every chant. Stories of farmers fighting to preserve their way of life, Indigenous communities defending their ancestral lands, and young people demanding action on the existential threat of climate change. These are the stories that are shaping the future of Canada, one protest at a time. In Quebec, farmers are about to lose close to 90% of their net income since 2022, as climate policies like carbon taxes and fertilizer emissions reduction targets cripple their margins. Massive investment firms are also pushing the cost of land out of reach. These purchases have driven up the price of farmland by an average of 16% annually. Average values for cultivated farmland in Ontario increased by 19.4% in 2022. Under these conditions, farmers cannot afford to farm. In Alberta, a 10-kilometer-long convoy of tractors and trucks snaked its way to the provincial capital, a powerful symbol of the growing opposition to the federal government's carbon tax. And in Montreal, a group of daring activists staged a 24-hour sit-in at the headquarters of one of Canada's largest banks, demanding that it divest from the fossil fuel projects driving the climate crisis. As the winds of change continue to blow across the Great White North, one thing is certain: the rising tide of protests will not easily be quelled. For in a democracy like Canada, the voice of the people is the ultimate source of power, and right now, that voice is ringing out loud and clear from coast to coast. In this video, we will spotlight the rising and ongoing protests in Canada, shedding light on the diverse array of social movements that are shaping the nation's landscape and sparking conversations about justice, equity, and change. At the forefront of this cacophony is the farmers' protest in Quebec. This protest, which began on April 10, 2023, is being led by the Union des Producteurs Agricoles, or the UPA, representing over 42,000 farmers across the province. The farmers are protesting against the provincial government's proposed agricultural land protection regime reforms. The government's proposed changes would make it easier for developers to build on agricultural land, which farmers say would threaten the province's food security and the livelihood of thousands of farmers. Recent projections from Agriculture Canada assert that net revenue on farms across the country is set to plummet to mere $66 million by 2024, a stark contrast to the bountiful harvests of years past. With 180,000 farms scattered across Canada, the implications are staggering, leaving just $350 per farm to cover essential expenses. According to the UPA, the proposed reforms could result in the loss of up to 100,000 hectares of agricultural land over the next decade, with 57,000 hectares of land already lost since 1998 because of this type of development, the equivalent of 40 hockey rinks per day. The farmers demand that the government abandon its proposed reforms and instead work with the agricultural community to find ways to protect and preserve Quebec's farmland for future generations. This stance is critical considering Canada's low amount of arable lands, a shoddy 2%, compared to 58% in France and 45% in the United States. This makes no sense. The protests have been largely peaceful so far, with farmers setting up tractors and other agricultural equipment outside of government buildings and along major highways. However, tensions are still rising as the government shows no signs of backing down. As of today, the government has yet to agree to a meeting, and the protests show no sign of slowing down. Next up, let's talk about the carbon tax protests. These protests, which have been ongoing since the federal government first introduced the carbon tax in 2019, have recently gained new momentum in the wake of the Supreme Court of Canada's ruling upholding the constitutionality of the tax. The protesters, composed mainly of conservative politicians, industry groups, and rural Canadians, argue that the carbon tax is an unnecessary burden on consumers and businesses that will do little to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. According to a recent report by the Parliamentary Budget Officer, the carbon tax is expected to increase the average household's expenses by $1,490 in Manitoba, $1,723 in Saskatchewan, $1,820 in Ontario, and $2,773 in Alberta per year by 2030. These amounts are consequential, especially for low-income Canadians struggling to make ends meet. The protesters argue that the government should invest in renewable energy and other green technologies instead of punishing consumers with higher taxes. The protests have taken various forms, from truck convoys to rallies outside government buildings. In February 2022, a group of farmers in Alberta organized a tractor convoy to the provincial capital of Edmonton to protest the carbon tax. The convoy, which stretched over 10 kilometers, caused major traffic disruptions and drew national attention to the issue. The same happened this year, with more than 300 farmers in Quebec driving their tractors through the streets of Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu on April 5th. Despite the protests, the federal government has shown no signs of backing down on the carbon tax. In fact, the government has pledged to increase the tax to $170 per ton by 2030 as part of its plan to meet Canada's Paris Agreement targets. As the tax continues to rise, it's likely that the protests will only intensify in the coming years. Moving on to the RBC fossil fuel protests in Montreal, this protest began on March 11, 2023, when a group of environmental activists staged a sit-in at the Royal Bank of Canada, or RBC, headquarters in downtown Montreal. The protesters, who are part of the group Extinction Rebellion Quebec, demanded that RBC divest from fossil fuel projects and invest in renewable energy instead. According to a report by the Rainforest Action Network, RBC is the fifth largest funder of fossil fuel projects in the world, with over $201 billion invested in coal, oil, and gas projects since the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015. The protesters argued that these investments are contributing to the climate crisis and putting the planet's future at risk. The bank, which has said its lending practices will reach net zero emissions by 2050, has also been accused of greenwashing, marketing itself as being aligned with the climate goals of the Paris Agreement while continuing to finance the fossil fuel industry. Greenpeace Canada says that since the Paris Agreement was enacted in 2016, the bank has contributed more than $250 billion US in funding fossil fuels. A March 2024 Greenpeace report calls on RBC to stop funding oil and gas companies that miss the mark and asks Ottawa to introduce rules to ensure federally regulated financial institutions are in line with Paris climate commitments and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. The sit-in protest at RBC's headquarters lasted for over 24 hours, with protesters occupying the building's lobby and refusing to leave until their demands were met. The protests drew a significant police presence, with over 100 officers surrounding the building at one point. In the end, 26 protesters were arrested and charged with mischief. Since the initial sit-in, the protests have spread to other RBC branches across the country, with protesters staging a die-in at strategic locations, lying on the floor to symbolize the deaths caused by the climate crisis. Similar protests have taken place in Vancouver, Calgary, and Halifax. Despite the protests, RBC has shown no signs of changing its investment practices. In a statement released after the initial sit-in, the bank said it was committed to working with its clients to transition to a low-carbon economy, but it would continue supporting the fossil fuel industry in the meantime. And yet, even as these protests rage on, another conflict simmers beneath the surface, one rooted in the complex geopolitics of the Middle East: the Israel-Palestine protest. This protest, which has been ongoing for years, has recently gained new momentum in the wake of the recent escalation of violence in the region. The protesters, who are largely made up of Palestinian Canadians and their allies, are demanding that the Canadian government take a stronger stance against Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories and its treatment of Palestinian civilians. According to a report by Amnesty International, over 5,000 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces since 2008, including over 1,000 children. The protesters argue that Canada's current policy of supporting Israel's right to self-defense while remaining silent on its human rights abuses is contributing to the ongoing oppression of the Palestinian people. The protests have taken a variety variety of forms, from rallies and marches to boycotts of Israeli products. In May 2021, a group of protesters in Toronto staged a Day of Rage rally outside of the Israeli consulate, calling on the Canadian government to impose sanctions on Israel and recognize the Palestinian right to self-determination. Despite the protests, the Canadian government has shown little sign of changing its position on the Israel-Palestine conflict. In a statement released in May 2021, then Foreign Affairs Minister Marc Garneau reaffirmed Canada's support for Israel's right to self-defense and called on both sides to de-escalate the violence. As the situation in Israel and Palestine continues to deteriorate, it's likely that the protests in Canada will only intensify in the coming months and years. Palestinian Canadians and their allies are determined to keep the issue in the public eye and to pressure the government to take a stronger stance in support of Palestinian rights. From farmers fighting to protect their lands, to environmentalists demanding action on climate change, to Palestinian Canadians calling for an end to Israeli occupation, these protests are a testament to the passion and determination of Canadians to fight for what they believe in. As activists lock arms and blockade entrances, they demand accountability from financial institutions complicit in the planet's destruction. Their message is clear: profits must not come at the expense of the environment, and the time for action is now. Throughout history, protests have been a powerful force for change, not just in the social and political spheres, but also in the economic realm. Time and time again, we've seen how ordinary citizens' collective actions can transform the foundations of our economic systems, creating new opportunities and paving the way for a more just and equitable future. And now, in Canada, we see a new generation of protesters taking up the mantle of economic justice. By demanding a more sustainable and equitable economy that prioritizes people and the planet over short-term profits, these protesters are laying the groundwork for a brighter future for all Canadians. They are poignant reminders that a nation's economy is not some abstract force beyond the populace's dictates, but a human creation that they can shape and mold in the image of their preferred values. If you like this video, hit the like button and help us spread the word. And don't forget to subscribe to get notifications on our latest news and analysis. In the meantime, check out one of these videos here to learn more. Thanks for watching.